Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Glad to see some people here on a very cold Ottawa night. I'm sure some people opened their door this evening and thought, nope, I'm not doing that. So it's good to see the faithful remnant, the core group that has come this evening. We're lucky to have with us for the second time this year, Father Bob Wild, who I'm sure everybody here knows is a priest of Madonna House and lives as a Pustinik, spending much of the week in prayer, writing, and giving spiritual direction. Father Bob was ordained a priest of the Diocese of Buffalo in 1967 after experiences both as a Trappist and a Carthusian before he was ordained. Since 1990, he's been the postulator for the cause of the servant of God, Catherine Doherty, and besides helping and editing of Catherine's early works, he also published his own books on Catherine Doherty, as well as the one tonight from Chesterton Press, Tumbler of God, Chesterton as Mystic. So, Father Bob.
You know, a small group of people can change the whole world. So this is the core group here tonight. So thank you for coming, such a cold evening. I'd like to thank especially John Gay, who is in the back there, the publisher of Chesterton Press. Thank him for setting up the book table for us. And he's the one that I'd like to thank publicly for publishing my book that I'm going to present to you this evening. So thanks, John, for coming. I hope you can take a look at what he brought along with him this evening. Chesterton got up to give a talk once and took some paper out of his pocket, put it on the lectern, and after talking for an hour, he walked away and someone picked up the paper and there was nothing on it. But I assure you that's not my procedure this evening. Whoops. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay. So the thesis of my book, Tumbler of God, is that Chesterton received a real mystical grace. That's the thesis of the book. This can't be proven, but an attempt can be made to demonstrate it. It's like when the church tries to look at the sanctity of a person through the process. She can't prove their holiness, but it can be demonstrated through a person's life and testimonies and witnesses. So I'm going to try and demonstrate from his life and his teaching that he received a real mystical grace. I'm not trying to demonstrate his holiness, although I believe he was also a holy person as well. But very specifically, it's to demonstrate he received a genuine mystical grace. Maybe you know, or maybe you don't know, that recently a priest has been appointed in England to start looking at the possibility of opening a cause for Chesterton. And it will be very important as part of that process, books that are concerned with his life with the Lord. Stratford Caldecott, some of you may know who he is, a great writer in England. He said that until now, talking about the publication of this book, we lacked a book that spoke openly of what is in the end the most important thing about Chesterton, his friendship with God. And so one of the important aspects of this book will be to help in the cause, please God, when it is opened in the near future. Another reason for trying to demonstrate a mystical grace is that when the Lord gives a special grace, it implies a mission. The graces are given mostly for others. It implies a need that the Lord has in the church and in the world. Many believe that Chesterton is one of the greatest Catholic apologists of the 20th century, perhaps of all time. And so the reception of a mystical grace will reinforce this conviction that he was especially given a grace to be an apologist for the Catholic faith in our time. Although there will be a strong intellectual content to my lecture this evening, my purpose most of all is to offer you a kind of insight into his mysticism that might be helpful in your own life with the Lord. So it's not simply to give you some intellectual ideas about what I'm talking about, but I hope that an insight into his kind of mysticism will be helpful for your own life with the Lord. And I'm going to define it eventually as a kind of a lay mysticism. For most of our history, lay people have been trying to relate to a kind of mysticism of the cloister, or of the desert, or of the contemplative life. I don't mean to deny the value of these spiritualities, but Chesterton said we need a new kind of saint, and I believe that we also need a new kind of mysticism. And so my main concern is not so much what Chesterton thought about this or that. He wrote about just about everything. But I might put it this way: I'm interested in the quality of his mind. The quality of his mind, which led me and others, as you'll see, to the belief that something more than deep intellectual thinking was at work in his amazing brain. I was led then to believe that his view of reality also involved a mystical grace, the vision he had of reality. And so my purpose this evening is to offer you something to deepen your own awareness of God's presence in your life. I will be quoting quite a bit from Chesterton, as I want you to hear his voice in the hope that his writings may have more of a place in your own life. Now, throughout the years, there have been writers and authors who mentioned this special quality of Chesterton's mind. Some of you here might know who Hugh Kenner was, the great Canadian literary figure. He said, it may be said without exaggeration that Chesterton ranks almost with St. Thomas himself in the comprehensiveness of his initial perception, and that very certainty and immediacy which makes it unnecessary for him to struggle at any time with any truth. And this places him, he says, in the hierarchy of the fathers and philosophers and even the doctors of the church. Now, ranking Chesterton with the fathers and doctors of the church is kind of a quantum leap in my own amazement at who Chesterton might be. And then when I came across the fact that von Balthasar, in his volume 2 of The Glory of the Lord, he said he would have considered Chesterton worthy of presentation as one of the figures that he treated. And I'm always kind of sad that he never included Chesterton. His evaluation of Chesterton would have been quite remarkable and valuable. There was another Jesuit, Father Quinton Lauer. He wrote a book, Chesterton, Philosopher Without a Portfolio. He wrote, "There is in faith, not only as Chesterton saw it, but also as it happened in him, more than just a hint of mystic vision, a scene of what rational mind all by itself could not fathom." So very simply, I'm going to say that because of the quality of his mind, it was something beyond just clever thinking. There was a special grace for his vision of the world. Father Ian Boyd, Canadian, editor of the great Chesterton Review, he wrote this: "What is most needed for an understanding of Chesterton's work is a definition of the special religious quality which permeates his mind." And that is kind of what the book is about, special religious quality that permeated Chesterton's mind. And so after noting that others see something extraordinary about Chesterton, the next step was to try and define mysticism, as I'm going to be using it for my talk. There is no one agreed upon definition of mysticism. So for example, if someone says, well, Chesterton wasn't a mystic, well, what definition are they using? Karl Rahner is the most significant Catholic writer on mysticism in recent decades. He writes, There is no generally received theology of mysticism within the body of Christian theology. There is an extraordinary variety of descriptions and systemizations of mystical experience. So my thesis is that Chesterton's mystical grace corresponds to one kind of traditional mystical experience. There's many kinds, but my thesis is that his grace corresponds to one kind. And so I don't want to be using the word mysticism in any loose sense, like the word love can mean almost anything today. And the word mysticism can be thrown around as well. But I want to try and show you that it corresponds to some traditional understandings of mysticism. Bernard McGinn is considered one of the foremost experts on Western mysticism. He has written up to now a 5-volume series entitled The Presence of God, The History of Western Christian Mysticism, and several more volumes are planned. So just as Dante took Virgil as his guide through the worlds of the afterlife, so I will be taking McGinn as my guide through the worlds of mysticism. I will be presenting some definitions of mysticism that I believe can be applied to Chesterton. There was a Jesuit philosopher of the 19th century, Joseph Marechal. He wrote, "Mystical experience is the direct, intuitive, unmediated contact in this life between the intelligence and its goal, the absolute." And this phrase here, it is the intuition of God as present, the feeling of the immediate presence of a transcendent being. The mystical in any given environment consists of a religious experience which is esteemed as superior to the normal, more direct, more intimate, or more rare. So it's that point that Chesterton's experience of the presence of God is at the heart of his mysticism. His definition seems to be made to order for my purposes. And this is the kind of experience I find articulated in Chesterton's writings. Karl Rahner was one of the great theologians of the 20th century. He has been called the mystical doctor because he wrote so much on mysticism. And after speaking about the great Spanish mystics such as Teresa and John of the Cross, he says this: "Besides this literature on the Spanish mystics, there is another body of spiritual literature which one may by no means ignore." And then this expression here, in which the mystical element thrusts through to expression time and again. I will argue that this mystical element thrusts through in Chesterton's writings. And I ask you to consider especially these next remarks of Rahner, as they are at the heart of Chesterton's mystical experience. Quote, "In the mystical experience, the mystical subject, the person, undergoes an immediate experience of the very mystery, sheer quintessential reality of God." And even more specifically, this comment, "Perhaps one could conceive of a mystical experience of oneness between subject and world as such, which the subject might thereupon precipitously identify with the oneness of the mystical subject with God himself." So I ask you to keep in mind this mystical experience that he mentions between the subject and the world, because I'm going to argue that Chesterton's mystical grace was precisely an experience of God in the reality of the world. An experience of God in the reality of the world. Thomas Merton needs no introduction. His comment is similar to Rahner, so I ask you to pay a special attention to it. Quote, "There is another kind of consciousness that is still available to the modern person, which starts not from the thinking and self-aware subject, but from being, ontologically seen to be beyond and prior to the subject-object division. This experience of being is totally different from an experience of self-consciousness." So my attempt to demonstrate Chesterton's mysticism will center on his experience of being in the world, and not on developing an intricate mental world which seeks to articulate one's union with God, like the Spanish mystics. But before we get into Chesterton's writings, I want to make some brief connections between Chesterton's experience of the presence of God that we'll be considering and what we find about Christ's experience in the Gospels. If we define mysticism as an extraordinary awareness of the presence of God, then Christ was the mystic par excellence. And what were the characteristics of his mysticism? I want to emphasize the simplicity of his relationship with the Father, and that his experience does not conform to many of the characteristics of mysticism written about in our tradition, and neither does Chesterton's mysticism. Of course, Christ does not so much have an experience of the presence, he is the presence, the second person of the Trinity. I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. I and the Father are one. And working miracles is sometimes considered a sign of holiness or of being a mystic. Yes, Christ worked miracles, but there is a difference. He performs them effortlessly. One could almost say naturally, without spiritual fireworks. And when he prays, he is not transfixed in ecstasies or elevated off the ground. Even in the Transfiguration, he is speaking quite naturally with Moses and Elijah. He prays quite naturally, speaking intimately with his Father, and probably with his eyes open, as was the custom of the Jews. And when he is asked to teach about prayer, he doesn't give complicated techniques. He simply says, when you pray, etc. And when he seeks to raise our minds to the Father, he doesn't counsel closing our eyes and purifying our thoughts from all distractions. He says, look at the lilies of the field, how the Father clothes them. Look at the birds of the air, how the Father takes care of them. And for his teachings and parables, he uses images from the ordinary life in the world. And so does Chesterton. In his book, The Everlasting Man, Chesterton makes this pithy observation. Relatively speaking, it is the gospel that has the mysticism and the church that has the rationalism. I interpret this to mean that Christ is the true mystic. It is some theologians and philosophers who, with their rational and intricate systems, have often distanced people from a real intimate contact with the presence. My main point here is that the simplicity of Chesterton's mysticism conforms quite well with the simplicity of the Lord's relationship with his Father. What mostly led me to believe in Chesterton's mysticism was how he thought and expressed himself about reality, and especially about the saints and the near saints. In other words, he didn't write a book on mystical prayer or on mystical theology. But my contention is that in describing the inner life of the saints, he is describing his own experience of God and reality. And so looking at his insights into reality will form the major part of my demonstration. And the very best place to begin is with his book on St. Francis, the Tumbler of God. This is my favorite book of Chesterton's, and the title of my book comes from his description of Francis's mysticism in this book. It was mostly this book that led me to consider that he also possibly received the mystical grace. It is often remarked that Chesterton is very autobiographical when writing about others. I believe this is especially true of his comments about the mysticism of St. Francis. It is in this book that I found what I call the essence of his mystical grace. So I present it now so that during the rest of the talk you can keep it in mind as we go through some of his other writings. The significant chapter in this book is called Le Jongleur de Dieu, and Chesterton says that the jongleur was properly a joculator or a gesture. Sometimes he was what we call a juggler. Sometimes he may have been a tumbler, like that acrobat in the beautiful legend who is called the Tumbler of Our Lady. And when St. Francis called his followers the Jongleur de Dieu, he meant something very like the tumblers of God. So Chesterton in this book will be using tumbling in a spiritual sense which caused a completely different view of reality in St. Francis. Chesterton often recommended standing on your head and seeing the world as sort of hanging, depending on God. He uses this image in reference to Francis as a psychological fact, and quote, he might see and love every tile on the steep roofs or every bird on the battlements of Assisi, but he would see them all in a new and divine light of eternal danger and dependence. He would be thankful to Almighty God that it had not been dropped. So keep in mind that Chesterton is describing some kind of mystical tumbling which results in seeing the world differently. And then he has this expression that is very significant for what I want to share with you. He says, it is also true that he, Francis, sees more of things themselves when he sees more of their origin. And then this line here, for their origin is part of them, and indeed the most extraordinary part. Realizing the origin of things is the most important part of their nature. Speaking again of the effects of this mystical tumbling is this. The saint sees the other side of things. He sees things go forth from the divine as children going forth from a familiar and accepted home, instead of meeting them as they come out, as most of us do, upon the roads of the world. And so we come now to what I consider the heart of his mysticism, and they are his comments about St. Francis. And to repeat, I believe when he is talking about Francis's experience, he's talking in some real sense about his own. So this is really at the heart of what I consider his mystical grace. At every moment, everything is actually proceeding from the abyss of the creativity of God. At every moment, everything is continually coming forth from the Lord. The mystic has entered this abyss and returned from it through his spiritual tumbling. And this abyss is so dreadful and formidable, so utterly fathomless, that Chesterton makes bold in the following passage to call it an almost nihilistic abyss. And so the following is one of the best and most moving explications of Chesterton's own mysticism, a striking keynote of which is praise. And so arises out of this almost nihilistic abyss the noble thing that is called praise, which no one will ever understand while he identifies it with nature worship or pantheistic optimism. When we say that a poet praises the whole of creation, we commonly mean that he praises the whole cosmos. But the mystic does really praise creation, and in this sentence here, in the sense of the act of creation, he praises the passage or transition from non-entity to entity. That is what I really believe is at the heart of his grace. He had some kind of profound experience of everything at every moment coming forth. The mystic who passes through the moment when there is nothing but God does in some sense behold the beginningless beginnings in which there was really nothing else. He not only appreciates everything, but the nothing of which everything was made. In a fashion, he endures and answers even the earthquake irony of the book of Job. In some sense, he is there when the foundations of the world are laid and the morning stars singing together and the sons of God shouting for joy. In this exquisitely mystical language, we have a superb overview of Chesterton's mysticism, quite evident in his constant intuition of the amazing it-is-there-ness of being. Philosophers say the most profound philosophical question, why does anything exist at all? And this is what amazed Chesterton. The very existence of things was part of his amazement. Equally, he is very much aware that at every moment creatures are originating from God. Since every moment is witness to the action of God's creating power, it is no mere hyperbole to say that the true mystic is ever present at the very foundations of the world. He said every week we should have the days of Genesis, because every week these things are being created, the fish and the birds and the oceans and the trees. For him, creation is an ongoing, present reality. So his mysticism consists of being aware that at every moment, and not just, as we say, in the beginning, at every moment God is creating and suspending everything by his creative act. This intuitive awareness that all is hanging on his power and proceeding from his pure graciousness lies at the source of Chesterton's mysticism. An even more exact way of describing his mystical grace would be this: a mystical awareness of the there-ness of being coming forth. At every moment, the creative act is present. The immediacy and vigor of his sense of mystic dependence arise obviously from the fruits of his own passionate experience of the presence. Continue with this theme that when Chesterton is speaking of the inner life of the saints, he is speaking autobiographical. We turn now briefly to his book on St. Thomas Aquinas. The great Thomistic scholar, Gilles Sommes, said it was the best book he ever read on the teaching of the great man. In our tradition, one kind of mysticism is that you turn off your mind and remain in the cloud of unknowing, the title of one of the books from the English mystical tradition. Countless quotes could be mustered to document this trend, turning off your mind, entering into some kind of cloud of unknowing. It's not the only trend, but one of them. It was not Chesterton's kind of mysticism. I believe he had the gift of knowledge, which has to do with seeing all of reality in the light of faith. And to exercise this gift, you have to use your mind. I believe Chesterton identified more with Aquinas than with St. Francis. He said once he couldn't have become a monk because it's too strenuous a life. I think he would have found the life of Francis a bit strenuous as well, but sitting and thinking and dictating to 3 secretaries at once, well, I think he could have handled that. I offer just a few reflections about St. Thomas that I contend describe Chesterton's own vision of reality and consequently describe his mysticism. For Chesterton, at least in this present life, the light from without was more brilliant than the light within. He did not wish to go up into the sky in a balloon before his time. The highest branches of his tree did almost reach the stars anyhow. He would rather wait for the real flowers to see the actual explosion than try to picture them in his mind. For him, the immortally active presence was mediated to him through all the lovely things the Creator was making at every moment. The presence of God was mediated to him through all the things that God, at the moment, was bringing forth into existence. The only mirror Chesterton didn't mind was the reflection of the truth of reality in his intellect. Both Aquinas and Chesterton contend that human consciousness then begins with the taste of the intuition of being. St. Thomas says emphatically that the child is aware of ends, that is being, And long before he knows that grass is grass or self is self, he knows that something is something. Perhaps it would be best to say very emphatically with a blow on the table, there is an is. Thomas and Chesterton begin their journey with the extraordinariness of being itself outside the mind. They believe we first taste, with the totality of our faculties, the elementary existence of things, and see afterwards. Their mysticism is not a reposing in the peace of timeless being, of an interior vision, but in the actual tasting of reality. And so my contention is that Chesterton's intuition went beyond simple awareness of being. For him, it was being coming forth. Now we could say that intellectually, and probably believe that, but his grace was that he had some kind of experience that this was happening at every moment, the creative act of God. In summing up the essence of Thomism, Chesterton says, Aquinas is arguing for the popular proverbs that seeing is believing, that the proof of the pudding is in the eating, that a man cannot jump down his own throat or deny the fact of his own existence. Because of his mystical intuition of the goodness of what he could see with his eyes, Chesterton was content to wait for the fireworks of eternity. Meanwhile, he did not want to miss this world in some kind of premature anticipation of the next. He knew that what he saw with his eyes was not all that he could reason to with his mind, but he found the actual goodness more captivating than an imagined or rational construct of the mind. Another source of insights into his mystical mind, you might say, is his poetry. And I'm just going to read one of his poems, which I think is quite extraordinary, showing this depth of his vision of the wonder of creation. It's called The Sword of Surprise. He writes, "Sunder me from my bones, O sword of God, till they stand stark and strange as do the trees, that I whose heart goes up with the soaring woods may marvel as much as these. And sunder me from my blood, that in the dark I hear that red ancestral fire river run, like branching buried floods that find the sea but never see the sun. Give me miraculous eyes to see my eyes, those rolling mirrors made alive in me, terrible crystal more incredible than all the things they see." And then this beautiful last stanza, "Sunder me from my soul, that I may see the sins like streaming wounds, the life's brave beat, till I shall save myself as I would save a stranger in the street." So in this book, I treat several other people who are often called mystics, William Blake, Tolstoy, Huxley. But according to my theme, in their somersaulting, they landed on their heads instead of on their feet. So we will not be considering them here, but in treating these mystics, Chesterton has many deep insights into true and false mysticism, comments on Gnosticism and spiritualism, and other related topics. I would just say briefly something about his understanding of God. Just a few remarks. Gary Wills wrote a book, Chesterton, the Man in the Mask, and he has a section where he talks about the riddling God. He used the expression, the riddling God. Chesterton said that all life, the Iliad is a great book because all life is a battle. The Odyssey is a great book because all life is a journey. And the book of Job is great because all life is a riddle. So he calls the book of Job a very modern book because it asks questions about God. It's okay to ask questions and to have doubts. He calls it the most interesting of modern books. Job is the first to ask questions of God, the same questions that Chesterton was asking in his own darkness. Nobody could have told Chesterton to stop doubting. This is not the way to satisfy questioning minds. From his own experience, he learned that in dealing with the arrogant asserter of doubt, it is not the right method to tell him to stop doubting. It is rather the right method to tell him to go on doubting, to doubt a little more, to doubt every day, newer and wilder things in the universe, until at last, by some strange enlightenment, he may begin to doubt himself. And that's how he concludes his little essay on Job, that he eventually came to doubt his own understanding of reality. So Chesterton, I believe, is a new kind of mystic. And in the early 90s, I was writing articles in All Things Considered, the Ottawa GK Society newsletter, on Chesterton's holiness and advocating his cause for canonization. And so I'd like to end these brief reflections with some comments from Maisie Ward's book, Return to Chesterton. Maisie Ward, her two books on Chesterton are still considered probably the best because she knew Chesterton and could interview people that knew him. And so I end with some of these quotes because in this book, in the introduction to Return to Chesterton, she says a number of things that agree with what I believe. So that's a joke. One of the most important things about Chesterton, this is Maisie Ward to me, that he came at a moment when he was tremendously needed to restore an imperiled proportion in the Christian world and to emphasize for us an element of mysticism that is sometimes forgotten. The especial danger today lies, I think, in the fact that one side of the Christian picture of life has been overemphasized as part of a violent reaction against the bourgeois smugness of the last century. Looking at men who choose the mountains and not the plains of life makes the gaze dizzy and fills the mind with turbulent thoughts. St. Anthony fighting Satan in the wilderness, St. Francis singing his way in nakedness and hunger and poverty, St. Catherine of Siena speaking to such purpose after 3 years' silence, the pilgrim on the frozen steppes of Russia with a bag of rusks for soul's sustenance, repeating the cry, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, with every breath he drew. The Curé of Ars spending a long life in a quiet village where the devil found and fought him, as he had fought Anthony in the wilderness. All these and thousands more flash into the imagination, which then turns its glance upon the daily life of millions of, she quotes, millions of normal people and asks, how can we and the saints ever live in the same heaven? Chesterton says, we are living on the same earth, and we are living in the same world as the saints, only they get more out of it. And one of the things, Maisie Ward goes on, they get out of it, it seems, to be an unquenchable and vital gaiety. Saints are not sad. I simply note that Ward speaks of Chesterton's mysticism and that it is for the millions whose place is on the plains of daily effort. He has been given the grace of a lay mysticism for the whole church. He is the herald of the dawn of that infant religion that thanks God for creation. As is well known, Chesterton was not merely, this is my own thoughts, as is well known, Chesterton was not really a very church-going man, although he performed his prescribed Catholic duties. Someone once remarked that the only time they saw Chesterton angry was he had to get up for Mass at 6:30 in the morning. He said, "What an ungodly hour for Mass." Maisie Ward also says, referring to many verdicts she received from her readers, "One is struck by two facts, a universal agreement that Chesterton is a very great man, and the widest disagreement as to wherein that greatness lay." And so my own opinion, I mentioned at the end of the book, is that his greatness lies in the profound depth of his mind that was anointed by a mystical grace. Why was it so important to try and prove that he was a mystic and received mystical grace? If it can be accepted that he received a genuine mystical grace, it will add to the appreciation of what he saw with this deeper vision. Those who have received mystical graces in our theological tradition, the great Carmelites, for example, use their vision to expand the mysteries of the faith and of the interior life. Now this point here, however, a mystical grace was given to Chesterton to illuminate the daily life of people in every aspect of life. This is a truly rare grace. I know of no other person in our whole 2,000-year tradition that had such a grace. He wrote about every conceivable topic, but in the light of faith. And that's why he is, I consider, perhaps the greatest apologist, certainly of the 20th century and maybe of all time. He could show us, in the light of faith, the reality of our ordinary lives. The Lord gives us the saints we need, not necessarily those we want or even understand. We need a saint like Chesterton, and this is a quote from him. "A saint is a medicine because he is an antidote." Indeed, that is why the saint is often a martyr. He is mistaken for a poison, because he is an antidote. He will generally be found resisting the world, restoring the world to sanity by exaggerating whatever the world neglects, which is by no means always the same element in every age. Yet each generation seeks its saint by instinct, and he is not what people want, but rather what people need. Therefore, it is the paradox of history that every generation is converted by the saint who contradicts it most. And so finally, how is saintly Chesterton an antidote to the modern world? What need does he fill? He is one of the thinkers who most contradicts the present generation. In an age when too many people consider material things the only reality, Chesterton, with his mystical grace, gift of knowledge, showed how the material creation must be seen with the transcendent eye. And he did this not by writing deep tracts from a monastic cell detached from the world, but precisely by being immersed in the world and talking about all the things of the world with a faith vision. He wanted to remain passionately in the world, reflecting on the everyday events in which ordinary people must live. In short, he loved the world. And through the particular mystical grace he received, I believe he brought mysticism back to earth. Thank you for your attention.